Good morning. Hemshech Hayim Beis, Volume 2. We're at the bottom, well, 2/3 down the page of 1220. Aleph Reish Chaf. Discussion here is about Gan Eden. That would be the main headline, Gan Eden. Of course, Gan Eden plays prominent role right at the beginning of Bereshis in Chumash, but especially when you look in Chazal, in Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah, Medrash, Midrashim, and different oral interpretations, and especially in Kabbalah and Chassidus, it takes on a whole dimension of Gan Eden being the place where Adam and Chava were placed to serve and protect. That was going to be their main habitat, their domain. And then Gan Eden in the context of being the place where neshamas dwell. And that's where they enjoy and take delight, the pleasure of the divine, Tainug. And here in Hemshech Hayim Beis, the Rebbe Rashab is now tackling this sugya. And I should mention, for those that want to perhaps look, which I always do, look at the sources, this whole sugya, this whole idea of Gan Eden, as discussed here, beginning back when it started on page 12, was it 1211, I believe? Yeah, 1211, and then continuing on 1213, and now returning back to the whole subject of Gan Eden, that this is based on a mimer of the Alter Rebbe that he delivered in Shabbos Parsha Porah, Tov Kuf Samach Beis, which would be the equivalent of 1792, I believe. Samach Beis, Ayin Gimel would be 1813, 1802. That's Tov Kuf Samach Beis, 1802. Am I correct? Samach Nun is 90. Yeah. 1802, Parsha Porah. And then explained at length, or written, I should say, and explained by the Mittler Rebbe in a Maimer in Teres Chaim, Shmois, where he also talks about it more at length. And then the Tzemach Tzedek, two Maimorim that I found, similar Maimorim on this topic in Parsha Chukas, Parsha we just read a week ago about Porah. So there he discusses Gan Eden, these two dimensions of Gan Eden, what Gan Eden is on its own, and Gan Eden, what happens to it through Avodah. Because we said the primary schar, reward, as he put it, which was that the benefit, that the primary neshama's benefit in Gan Eden is is a reward of doing to the mitzvahs and the good deeds that are done, that are like flames, candles that light flame, that generate energy, that fill up Gan Eden. And the discussion was, which is also in those Maimarim, so then what is Gan Eden on its own, and what is it once a human being comes into it? In other words, Gan Eden before Adam was placed there, the human being was placed, and once there's an Avodah L'Avda L'Shamra of working and protecting the garden. So that's part of this discussion here, which we're in the middle of, but it's all based on those Maimarim, and a lot of the themes that we're discussing are there, very specific. Obviously, it's more elaborated upon here in Ayin Beis, but I just wanted to give you that source. Okay, so what do we learn? Where are we up to in this context? So after explaining at length the process of creation itself, from Ani Rishon to Vani Achrin, from Keser to Malchus, and that itself, all the different dimensions, the 10 spheres within Malchus, Keser Malchus of each world, all the way back to Malchus of Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum. So after discussing how that all works, that process, from Tainug, from the first state of, we'll call it the highest state of divine super consciousness, to Ratzon, desire, will, to Chachma, to Bina, shaping and designing through the Midas of Zah, that develop it further through Malchus. That's how the creation process works. With that, we also understand how Gan Eden works, because part of creation is the creation of Gan Eden as a unique, so-called within existence itself, it has unique status. It's created with higher revelation, that it has access to the Keser and the Chachma and Bina, essentially to the Tainug, of the original plan, of the original source. Whereas the rest of the worlds, their main access is to the existence of the divine presence. That's in the Zayin Tachtenis, the 7 lower levels. But Gan Eden has access also to the inner workings to some extent. So essentially, Gan Eden, which resides, Gan Eden Elyon, which its place, its location is in Bina, or specifically Keser Chochma Bina, but primarily Bina, through the lens of Bina, of understanding, in the world of Bria, which originates from Keser Chochma Bina within Malchus of Atzilus, which originates in Keser Chochma Bina of Atzilus in general, which originates to the highest levels of Keser Chochma Bina all the way before the Tzimtzum. So essentially, in Gan Eden, you have in it that presence of that Tainug. As we learned yesterday, how in Atzilus the process begins, because in Atzilus you have first Keser, then you have Rotzen, and then you have Chochma, and then Bina, all the way to Malchus, and that then radiates into Gan Eden in Bria. And as we discussed, that throughout the Eitz HaSoda, which is Zoh of Atzilus, we talked about Chochma as Eden, and Eden Ilah as Keser. So those are the so-called seeds. Just using a analogy of planting here, that when that goes through the process will ultimately create Gan Eden in the world of Bria. However, there needs to be also a qualification that Gan Eden is already more of a manifestation in the world of Bria and creation, whereas Atzilus is still the world of emanation. So now we're discussing what is the distinction between the pleasure as it stands and the delight in Gan Eden and Bria, in contrast to the way it is in Atzilus. So he says, and this will sum up what we learned, that now God planted a garden in Eden. He says this Lashon Atiyah, so even though it's a plant, from there he's planting it in Bria. I'll just read over this important line. So though the pleasure or the Tainug of Gan Eden, Nimshach, is drawn from the level of Tainug Hamalubish B'Chochma from Atzilus, in other words, Keser within Chochma, nevertheless, nevertheless, they're infinitely apart. They're distant from each other. And he compares it, like the distance from a planted seed compared to the Mazal from where it grows out from. Because as we know, every blade of grass has a Mazal above, a spiritual entity that so-called takes care of and watches over and strikes it and says, grow. So though it originates from the Mazal, you can't compare the Mazal to the seed in the ground, to the blade of grass. The blade of grass is a physical entity. The Mazal is a spiritual entity. And he compares it to taste. The taste of the sweetness, say, of an apple, compared to the koyach hatzemeach, the force that makes things grow within earth. So even though that force that makes it grow makes the apple tree grow, and therefore the apple is a result of that, yet you can't compare the two. You're not going to find sweetness like you do when you put sweetness at your palate or the top or your mouth, that you taste sweetness. And yet it still originates from a level of sweetness. So we spoke about the archetype. What is the archetype? It originates from the level of chesed. Chesed is the source of sweetness, and gvura is the source of bitterness. And yet you can't compare them. On one hand, you can't compare them because one is physical, one is spiritual, one is ethereal. On the other hand, they have similar property because sweetness has many levels, like he says. There's a sweetness, you could have sweetness, the examples he gave, or just to go over the examples. The pleasure you have, says there are many types of sweetness, even in spiritual levels. The sweetness, the pleasure and sweetness that comes from a dvar chochma, from an idea. There's the sweetness in midas, being kindness and love has a sweetness. There's the sweetness in a song, which comes from the chetzenius hamidas. Also emotion, but from the chetzenius, from the voice, a beautiful voice, a sweet voice, we say. So all things are sweet, But at the end of the day, it's not physical. But on the other hand, the kama yiridis, like he says, hishtalshlus, in a series, in a progressive series of evolutionary steps, nasa mesikas gashmi, it will evolve and become a physical, in other words, take on a physical shape and form. Once you add the physical form to it, then it takes on physical sweetness. Even though there's a very big separation and difference between them. Okay, that's where we stopped. We're going to go to Gan Eden now. But before I do that, I just want to explain this a bit more. I want to just now, there's something I just want to add that'll make it a little easier to understand as well. And that's something I did share not so long ago. There's a story and a sikha from the Rabbi that explains an interesting story. So it was before Pesach one year, and they were all cleaning out for chametz, the last remnants of chametz in the house, including in the pockets. And the Frierdiker Rebbe was a young child. They're cleaning out his pockets, and they find candies. What are these candies? So the Frierdiker Rebbe said, these are the candies that were thrown to me when I was when I finished. When I was led into cheder. So there's a custom that when you take a child for the first time to school, to Hebrew, to the early stage, his first time he goes to cheder, which is like the children's school, yeshiva. So you wrap him in a talis, and you throw candies and say, this is Malach Machal throwing these candies. So Frierdiker Rebbe said he didn't want to throw out the candies for Malach Machal. Obviously, they were chametz, so they had to be discarded. But that's where the Frierdiker Rebbe held on to them. So the Rebbe asked a klutz kasha, simple question. We tell children we're throwing candies. We say it's Malach Machal. The truth is the parents are throwing it, or the teacher, whoever's throwing the candies. The child will get older, and they'll discover what kind of Malach Machal people did it. That how you educate a child? By telling him a lie? It's a sheker. It's not a proper education. And the Rebbe's answer is essentially what it says right here. No, it's the truth. Malach Machal is a ruchni, is a spiritual angel. He represents chesed. Chesed is the source of sweetness. A child may not understand yet, or comprehend, so the parents are serving as shluchim, as ambassadors, as emissaries of Malach Machal in a physical form, and giving the child something, identifying the child with sweetness in a way he can understand. Because the candy, at the end of the day, is just the embodiment of chesed, of Malach Machal's sweetness, and chesed above. And the only way to relate to it is this fashion. When he grows older, he'll be able to understand how this is a lavush, a garment, a keli, a body, to the spiritual sweetness. The same reason you smear, when you teach a child, to begin to teach Aleph Beis, the custom was, and still remains, you teach Aleph Beis, and on a page, sometimes a laminated page, and you put on it honey and sugar and all kinds of sweet, so the child should understand that Torah is sweet, should associate Torah with sweetness. At this point, the sweetness takes on a shape that a child can understand, like a mashal, like an example. And then the child will learn deeper levels of sweetness. So now he's going to go back and explain how this is an example for the difference between Gan Eden and the sweetness in Gan Eden, or the tainug in Gan Eden and the tainug in Atzilus. But before I continue, this was a summary. Does anybody want to ask anything? If not, I'll just continue learning on page 1220. Okay. So like this now. I'm reading from the line that begins with a parenthesis. The line is like 2/3 down the page. And the pages can be found at ayinbeis.com if you want to follow along. So here's what the kachua inyan began Eden, and so too is this idea in Gan Eden. Hagam shatainu hanimshel began Eden. Though the pleasure and the delight that's drawn into Gan Eden, whom is drawn is nimshach mebchinas hachachma, is coming and originating from the level of chachma and atzilus. Afal pikein ein arech b'neihem. So though it originates from there and is drawn from there, just like the sweetness in the apple is drawn from chesed, but ein arech b'neihem. There's a distance between them. Ein arech, some ein arech would be like an infinite. You can't compare them even. Ein arech. I'm trying to avoid using infinite distance because infinite would be really very, very far apart. Ein arech is a strong apartness, not erech. There's nothing, no, erech would be there's something commensurate, like when you go from one rung to another rung. So even though one level is higher, but they're relatively in relation with each other. Here's an ein arech element to them. And this is like ha'esev, the blade of grass, legabe hamazal, in comparison to the mazal that we spoke about that strikes it and says grow. So the mazal and the esev, even though the esev would not grow without it, however, what's their similarity in their identities? The similarity is one is spiritual, one is physical. So he says that's the comparison. And now he explains a little Kabbalistically what Esev is. He says Esev is the letters is made up of two words. Ab or three. It's three letters. Esev. It's ayin beis and a shin. Esev, ayin shin beis, which consists of ayin beis and a shin. Shezeu hamshachas hadas. So as is usual in Chassidus, even though it's an example for Gan Eden, but he goes a little deeper, that Esav is, even though its word means grass, but it's rooted in the spiritual name of God. Ayin Beis and Ashin. And he quotes the beer, the explanation in Torah of the Alter Rebbe, the Maimar of Elim Mashpatim, that it's Hamshachas Hadas. I would have to look up there to see exactly how that works, but I am assuming that Ayin Beis Shin, that Ayin Beis is probably connected to the name Ab, and Shin, not sure how it works with Das, but he says it, so we'll look it up. Right now, I don't have the Sefer in front of me, but I'll look it up and let's see what he says there. But we can trust that it says it there. Ayin Beis Shin, so it's Hamshachas Hadas. What is that in Ruchni? What is that in the spiritual sense of it? So the Rebbe Rashab is not just an example, a remote example that's not related to the subject matter of grass and its mazel. Grass actually represents the Yediyas Hashem, which is the level of Yediyah V'Asaga. Remember, Bina, the knowing and the understanding of Eloki's divine understanding and comprehension in Gan Eden. So the Ruchnius of Esev is actually the idea of Gan Eden. So though it began as an example, but it's actually a reality. So the grass on earth is compared to the Mazal is like Gan Eden compared to Atzilus, and he's comparing Esev now to Gan Eden. Now, of course, we're talking now the Ruchnius in Gan Eden, compared to the Esev Gashmi is a physical grass. The Mazal is a Ruchni. But he's now talking about the spirituality of Esev, and that relates to Gan Eden. And he adds more. Ubezoyar. So now we also understand another thing. Remember at the top of the page, he said everything is about netias, about planting. So you see, everything here is our examples and references used all about growth. So though in Gan Eden we talked about trees, but there's also grass. So the grass in Gan Eden is what he's talking about right now. Now, obviously, we're talking on a spiritual level, Gan Eden, but compared to Atzilus, it's like physical grass compared to the Mazal. We'll get back to that shortly. But right now, he's developing the case that Esev, in other words, grass, is referring to the level of Yediyah V'Asaga in Gan Eden. Whether he discusses the difference between trees and grass, I don't know if he says it here. There are Maimarim that talk about that. But let's see what he's going to say, because he's going to add now, like this. Ubezoyer vayikra, Daf Yud Beis Amud Aleph, in the Zohar, in the volume 3, page 12a, Kosav, Bepirish Tatshe Ha'aretz, Deshe. Esev. So in the pasuk where it says in the day 3 of creation that God planted Tache Odes Desha, that the earth should generate, the earth should sprout with growth and desha, growth and grass. Shahu Inyan, says the Zoyar, Yichud Zun. This is the Yichud, the unification of Zah and Malchus. Again, I would have to look into the Zoyar. I'm not sure how he connects it. Is that Desha and Esev? Or is it the whole concept of making things grow? Is the Yichud of Zah and Malchus. Most likely because Malchus is earth and Zah makes things grow. So it could be that a very idea of growth is connected to Zun. But I want to look it up before I say definitively. V'hainu canal. So what do we see from this? That Teitcher is Desha. Hainu canal, like we spoke earlier, the Gili Hataynu Shebegan Eden, Huma Einig Elyon, the Kesra Mislabish B'chachma B'zah. So based on the Zoyar, that the growth, the vegetation, very growth comes from the Yichud Zun. So that's exactly what we learned on top of the page earlier. That what? That the Gili of Tanya Gan Eden, where things grow in Gan Eden. Where is it rooted from? It's rooted in the pleasure, the supernal pleasure of Keser, which manifests in Chachma and Zoh, which is Zoh v'nimshir b'malchus, malchus nimshir b'Gan Eden. So it all rounds out now. So the Zoyar essentially supports the idea that the Gan Eden, which is in Bria, receives from Malchus and Zoh and Chachma all the way back from Keser. So what the Zohar says, Yichud Zun, Yichud of Zoh and Malchus, is part of the process that will develop into Gan Eden. So on one hand, Gan Eden is rooted there. But at the same time, and yet, as he said before, all this, the example for it is Netiyah, which comes to also explain what he said on top. Why is everything connected? Why does the Medrash say from the beginning God did everything through planting? Because planting has both elements. On one hand, that's something that grows out of the planting, is a growth that originates in a higher state. But on the other hand, it's like a planting. And planting means it's a different state. So it tells you both that it originates there, but at the same time, that there is an infinite distance between the pleasure in Gan Eden and the way it is, where it was planted from, where it originated from. In Chachma, Rakshin is Gashem, Nasa Tainug, Shiemusigu Murgis Neshamas de Biyah. But now, this Gashem here doesn't necessarily mean physical, it means it's become concretized and solidified to the point that it's a Tainug that can be understood and felt by the Neshamas and Gan Eden in Biyah. So in Atzilus, it remains still ethereal, relatively speaking. But from there, just like the Mazal forms the grass, the same thing, these levels in Atzilus, from Keser all the way to Malchus, which create the Desha, like he said, the planting, the vegetation, the growth, forms Gan Eden. So on one hand, it originates from there, but on the other hand, it's infinitely distant because now it needs to be comprehended and contained by neshamas of Biyah that are not Atzilus. So Gan Eden is an interface between Atzilus and Biyah, and it's providing the neshamas a taste of those pleasures, the pleasure, but in a way that they can contain it through their understanding and their feelings. Musug Murgish, he says, which of course makes sense because it's coming from Keser through Chachma Bina, that's Musug, that's comprehension, and the Midas, and Midas is Murgish, feeling, into Malchus, and from there into Gan Eden. So Gan Eden, the Neshamas now are getting that type of pleasure, both in their comprehension and their feelings, their emotions that originate from Atzilus. So on one hand, it's coming from there. On the other hand, it's an infinite step away because it's now become more solidified and concretized in comparison to the ethereal nature of these levels in Atzilus. Okay. So let me stop here for a moment and just say one or two things, and then if anyone wants to ask anything. What I wanted to say was, And looking up and researching this, it actually in the Medrash it says that Gan Eden was created. I mentioned that it was created on day 6, because it seems so when you read Chumash. But in Medrash it says Gan Eden was actually created on day 3. When it says that God created vegetation, so part of that would have been the Garden of Eden. However, it wasn't yet the garden as we know it, and I still have to do a little research how that evolved, because there's different medrashim on the topic that talk about how God took. One medrash talks about how he planted seeds on day 3, then he took those seeds and transplanted them in Gan Eden, and from there would come the Gan Eden as we know it in Chumash on day 6, that Adam is placed in it. So it's not 100% clear what was created on day 3 and what was created on day 6. I just wanted to mention that. Like V'nor Yotzeh Me'Eden, that seems to have happened on day 6, not on day 3, that a river flowed from Eden. But you can't know for sure. You could say it was all put in place and he's just describing it in day 6. I just wanted to mention that as an aside. It needs a little research. If anybody wants to do some research, interesting topic, when Gan Eden was actually created. Now we learned that Gan Eden itself originates before creation. The Medrash said that Shiva Dvarim, remember on page 1219, last page, he said that there are things that Niver Kedem Shiva Dvarim Kodmula Elam. But that's, of course, the spiritual state of a Gan Eden. Day 3 is already a physical reality that God is creating vegetation in this world. So it would seem to make some V'yita Hashem Elikim Gam Ben Eden. So that's more from the spiritual level. But regardless, I just wanted to make that point in case anybody was wondering. So let me stop here for a moment and ask any questions, if anybody has any questions or comments. So on this, on what we just learned. Anything? No? Okay. Good.
Actually, the fact that lends credence that it was created on the 6th day, because the 6th millennium is when Chassidus goes, so it sort of gives weight to that argument.
I don't know if you can prove anything from that, but I hear you. Remember, there was Gan Eden before Chassidus was revealed. Gan Eden, the Neshamas have been dwelling Gan Eden from the beginning of time. But I hear what you're saying. Okay. Nothing else? Fine. So let's continue. So now he says, V'ima yes. So now we've made this so-called parallel, the planting and sowing, coming from one level to the next. So on one hand, Gan Eden originates from the higher levels in Atzilus. On the other hand, there's an Ein Arech, similar to the distance between a physical reality, or physical sweetness and spiritual sweetness, or physical grass and the Mazal. That's the comparison. So he says now, when it comes to grass, physical grass, that's Bria Yesh M'Ayin. The Mazal is a spiritual entity. So even though here, when we're talking about Gan Eden, it's not Bria Yesh M'Ayin Mamish. And let's see how he's going to continue. Ukamoy, b'moshel hamesikus, like in the example, the above mentioned example of sweetness. Shenimsa mesikus gam beruchnis. We find sweetness also on an ethereal level. Kamoy b'seichel umidas, like we find sweetness in mind, a sweet, it feels sweet, a sweet idea, sweet feeling, sweet expression. The gamma mesikas bechech, and also the sweetness in the palate, the human palate. Oichel yitam, eichel yitam. The palate that when you eat, you taste that physical sweetness. How does it gamkin ke'en ruchni? That's also ke'en ruchni. He's adding something new now. It's also relatively spiritual, because compared, for example, to touch, we have 5 senses: sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell. So compared to touch, taste is somewhat more ethereal. It's true, it's not like mesikus of a seichel, sweetness of seichel or sweetness of midas or of a song, but it's still a more subtle form of a sense. Touch, we know, is the most tangible. The truth is sight, sound, and smell are also relatively ethereal. but he's talking here about taste. So in other words, that just like we're saying that Gan Eden is not Bri Yesh M'Ayin Mamish, like we see by the taste, even though it's true that physical taste is incomparable to spiritual taste, but to say that it doesn't have, it also has an ethereal nature to it. Valkain, and therefore, even though it's not of the same personality at all, to say that physical taste is the same personality as spiritual taste or ethereal taste, like he said earlier, it still comes from the same combination of ingredients and personality. So in other words, it has something that is very different, but also has something that's in common. So in other words, you can't call it Yesh M'Ayin Mamish, because Yesh M'Ayin, there's nothing in common between Yesh and Ayin. Yesh and Ayin are absolutely two different realities. The Ayin is called Ayin, as we learned, first of all, because we don't understand it. It's not of the same matter. There's nothing in common between Yesh and Ayin. That's why we call it Ayin. In Ilav Alul, cause and effect, you could say something is coming from a deeper level, and it's coming now into a more tangible level. Like we're talking about sweetness. So that's not called Yesh M'Ayin Mamish. It's still a Yesh, relatively speaking, to a more spiritual state, but there's something more in common about it. So he says, so now he's qualifying it in return. First he said the Tainug is coming from Atzilus. Then he qualifies and says they're infinitely distant. But then he's now bringing them closer. So he says, same thing, Gan Eden. It's not Yesh M'Ayin Mamish. We're literally a creation, like you would say, let's say the Olam is not Gan Eden. There it's a creation. They are absolutely a new entity that doesn't have anything in common with the spirituality that creates it. So even though it's not Yesh M'Ayin Mamish L'gabe HaTainug Shebachachme, compared to the Tainug, the pleasure in Chachme and Atzilus, like I just said, not like the worlds, where there is nothing in common, which come from the Zayin Tachtenis, as opposed in contrast to Gan Eden. He doesn't say which mimer, so below they wrote maybe it's the mimer Hanal, which would mean the mimer of Shaftim, not Shaftim. Sorry, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, the first mimer, because it discusses it there. She says, look there, where it talks about the Mazal and the Koyach et Sameach, the Mazal and the Koyach et Sameach, the power of growth in earth, the Kamei Kain Yuvan Kan. From there, you could also understand similarly here. So we need to look that up to see what it says there. But that's the parentheses. Regarding, however, Gan Eden, he's saying that's not like the Olamus. It's not Yesh M'Ayin Mamish. And nevertheless, it's infinitely distant and similar to Yesh M'Ayin. So as I pointed out a number of times, especially in Ayin Beis, he sometimes says something is a level, then he says it's Mamish. Same thing here. It's similar to Yesh M'Ayin, but not quite Yesh M'Ayin. And that shouldn't throw us, because remember, we're talking all about very subtle levels here. So Yesh M'Ayin would be a picture of two entities, one creating, one is a creator, and one is the creation, a producer and a product. But they don't have anything in common in a revealed level. That doesn't mean that they cannot connect with Avodah and so on. But Begilui, there's nothing in common between, let's say, a blade of grass and the Koyach Yesh M'Ayin that God is investing in creating it. We're not talking about the Mazal of the grass. We're talking about the Koyach of Yesh M'Ayin, creation of the grass, not that which is making it grow. Gan Eden, on the other hand, this is like nothing in common between a stone and the creator of the stone, except that the Eibishter said the words, the letters of the Hebrew alphabet that ultimately created the stone. So it's a force that created it, but there's nothing in personality in common. You look at a stone, unless you mizbeinen and contemplate and start saying, let me find and discover the divine lessons or the divine shgacha pratis, divine providence, or the divine wisdom in the creation of a stone, but on an obvious level, you're not going to see it. In Gan Eden radiates with a tainug of Elokus. The neshamas are benefiting from it on their level. So it's on one hand, it's ke'en Yesh M'Ayin because it's not comparable to the spiritual ethereal state in Atzilus. On the other hand, it's originating from there and it has something that's in common. So that's why he calls it ke'en Yesh M'Ayin. Something in common, but not quite enough to call it complete Yesh M'Ayin. So because there's something revealed in a revealed state that's in common. So that's the expression ke'en Yesh M'Ayin. So it's ein arech and like ke'en Yesh M'Ayin at the same time, there's something that is in common, which in context of interface makes total sense. Because in interfaces, just to give an example of, let's take example of Bein Hashmoshes, sundown, sunset, twilight. So you could have had, the Eibishter could have made that the sun sets and right away dark. Didn't make it that way. The sun sets slowly. It gets first less bright, till the point it gets grayish. Then it becomes twilight until finally darkness settles in. It could take a good hour till that happens. From the Shkia till Tzesek Rechavim. Whatever the amount of time, different calculations. What do you have from that? Because the Eibishter wanted everything should be in progression. Things should not be radical leaps. Everything should make sense. A baby, a fetus goes through 9 months of development, doesn't jump. And everything in life grows that way. So in the process of interface between the divine and existence, and we spoke interface has to have something in common between two levels. So you have different ways that works, but a real interface is never going to make a radical leap. Because if it's a radical leap, something's going to be missing. If a student and a teacher, the teacher is teaching the student and everything's smoothing, and suddenly the teacher drops a bomb that overwhelms the student, it undermines the relationship that the student should be able to grow properly. So in a sense, and we learned this in the beginning of volume 2, that there were 4 relationships between Elokus and the world and existence. One is Gilead Helam, which is the closest relationship. It's concealed and revealed. The other extreme was Yesh M'Ayin, where it's completely two different Yesh and Ayin. The other two were Koyach and Poyel, like a Koyach, a potential and an actual. And the fourth was Etzem and Ispashtus, a core state and an extension of it, like let's say the sun and sunlight. He also spoke about a fifth, Hiyuli and Poyel. Hiyuli is even a deeper potential state. But the point is, all of them are necessary in the interface. So the fact that Gan Eden is not a Yesh M'Ayin mamish, of course, is a tremendous necessary step, because it's on our terms, and the Neshamas and Biyah could comprehend and feel it. And what are they feeling? The divine delight from a higher level. At the same time, there's a certain distance. So that's why we can relate to it. But at the same time, it also has something in common. So in a way, it's like something that has a piece of both of Atzilus and Bria, or Biyah, as we shall learn. So that's Gan Eden's role. Olam, the purpose of Olam is to actually create a Helam Behester, a state of concealment, because that's the Kavanah. God did not create the world for Gan Eden. Gan Eden is part of the process of how do we connect with godliness, whether it's on our own, whether it's Gan Eden on its own, or through our Avodah, which we'll learn about later, soon actually. But the purpose of God, of existence, is Dira B'Tachtenim. God wants a world where there's no Gilui, a world Tachten Shein Tachten Lamata Memenu, complete concealment to the point that you can have a world that defies God, Mole Klippas V'Sitra Achra, to the point Aniva Afsi Eid, a world that can say I and nothing else, completely denying godliness. And in that world, we should reveal godliness. But in the process, we need to have the interfaces to help us achieve this. So Gan Eden plays this tremendous role because it is a mamutza, an interface between Kedem HaParsa, before the partition of Atzilus, and the world of Bria, where the neshamas reside in Gan Eden and can benefit from it. That's essentially what he said now in this whole context, in different language and terms. So, since we just finished this paragraph, anybody wants to ask anything or any clarification, I'd be happy to address anything you may want to bring up.
I have a question about how close or proximate the neshamas are in Gan Eden to godliness, to God Himself, which you just described is very, very far apart, but not quite so far apart that they're completely, infinitely apart. You just went through 10 minutes of that. On the one hand, on the other hand, when we talk about the Gula Shlema, the ultimate final redemption of the world, we have the third Beis Hamikdash, and we have the Shekhinah dwelling in this earth. It seems as though there's a much closer relationship between us and our neshamas and on the one hand, and God on the other hand. Almost, I mean, I don't know if you could say it's we're going to see Atzilus. I don't know if that's possible, but forgive me for my ignorance on exactly what level of godliness we're going to be revealed. It's going to be revealed to us in the Gula Shlema. But it heretofore, until this point, it seems as though it was a much closer type of proximity between us and godliness. And similarly, in Gan Eden from Adam Harishon, it seems as though there was a dwelling of the Shekhinah there pretty closely, like God spoke to Adam Harishon. And so it seems as though there was a closer connection between God and our soulful person, human soulful energy in those examples versus what's being described here. It's lovely, but he's still saying Ka'ain. It's almost like Ka'ain Yesh M'Ayin, or it's Ayin, and there's this great distance Aruch. So do you understand the two?
Question? So what's your question?
Well, my question is, which is it?
I just explained. It's like twilight that has elements of one and elements of the other, like any interface. Like any interface, it's a teacher and a student. On one hand, the student is understanding what the teacher. On the other hand, there's a certain infinite distance between them, but not complete. That's exactly like you said. I did explain that for the last 10 minutes, but that's the point. As I've said a number of times, the only way to really appreciate this is to find an example in your own Avodah, in your own personal life, where you are so-called straddling the fence and trying to bridge two worlds. Everything about this is about bridging your reality and a godly reality. Everyone has their own challenges in this regard. So if you really want to understand it, it's not going to be understood with mathematical formulas and logical calculations. It's going to be only understood. It'll only be appreciated if you can find an example in your own life where you're living on one hand the material life, on the other hand you're beginning to get a taste of something greater, and then there's different levels in that. And there's a level called Gan Eden, which he says is on one hand has a taste, on the other hand, it's Ka'ain Yesh M'Ayin. So you're not going to have a black and white answer. That's the whole point. That's exactly what Ka'ain means. It's not black and white.
Okay, no, I get it. Thank you. That was very helpful. Also, so in other words, those examples, the mashlim I gave about the state of being and when Adam Harishon was in Gan Eden, and the state of being when there's the final redemption and the Shekhinah is dwelling on this earth, and this description here, those are three separate, call it sugyas or separate concepts, and you're saying essentially they're all.
Yeah, we're talking
all
here
the same
about.
Thing.
I didn't say they're all the same thing. No, they're different levels. In the future, there'll be another level of revelation that we didn't have till now. In the beginning of creation was another level. These are Maimorim that talk about in history, there were different stages of divine revelation. We know that before the eating of the tree of knowledge was one state. Then there was another state. And then there were states in each generation, 7 generations until Avram, then Yitzchak and Yaakov. Every generation in history has a different level of relationship with godliness. It all depends. We're now in the 3 weeks. This is after the destruction of the temple was another state. Before the destruction of the temple was a previous state. The first temple was different than the second temple. When the Jews left Egypt was another state. When they stood by Kriyas Yamsuf was another state. By Matan Torah was another. I mean, basically anything that you're going to look at in history can be understood in what level of revelation there is. I wouldn't call it in the context of Gan Eden. You're talking now much broader. Here he's talking Gan Eden, so I would stick to that. But if you're asking in general, that's exactly what life is all about. In a person's individual life, from one day to the next, you could say even from 1 minute to the next, we have different levels. Sometimes we succumb to the animal soul, and sometimes we don't. So everybody can find in their own life places where they're closer, and then distant, and then try to make it even closer. This is called Avodah Hashem, growth, how we all grow in the personal level. Right now, he's talking about it in the conceptual level of what is Gan Eden in context to Atzilus. But if you start bringing it into try to understand all the levels, the best way is to find yourself in the picture and find an example. Here, he's obviously not applying it yet. This is not being applied to our lives. He's talking independently. What is Gan Eden before he even spoke about Avodah, which we're going to learn now, the next paragraph. But he's talking about Gan Eden in context of Atzilus and so on, because this is part of the map. He's laying out the map in the context of Ayin Beis, especially if you learn earlier, it fits in as an interface between now Atzilus and Bria. That's where he's at right now.
Okay. Great, awesome.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. I just said thank you. That was very helpful.
Okay. So anybody has any other questions? Okay. So let's start the next paragraph. All this is Gan Eden on its own. Gan Eden created by God, he planted, Vayita Gan Be'eden, Vayita Hashem Elikim, Shem Mole. He planted a garden, and that garden is a creation by God with a special focus and special focus and function, and that is to have a place after Atzilus, in Bria, and the lower worlds, a place where the Tainug, the divine pleasure, is manifest in a way that souls can relate to it and internalize it. As we learned on last page 1219, the end of the paragraph there, this is Gan Eden mitzad atzmei. The Hainu Amshachas b'chinas bina shemer sham tamid she'en ze Amshachas she'ayidei Avodah kim zeu habriya de Gan Eden. That's the creation of Gan Eden. And also souls delight in Gan Eden, because the souls, before they came to this world, that's their place, that's their location. Stated very clearly at the end of the paragraph on page 1219. But now let's go back. What about the Avodah? We talked earlier, how much did we talk about? That the primary Giluyim in Gan Eden come through effort, through the gardener, through the gardeners. La'avda l'shamra, Adam working, Avda serving and protecting the garden, which we learned is Ramach Mitzvah, the 248 positive mitzvahs, the 365 negative ones, compared it to Karbonis, he compared it to Neris, to candles, and it said Karbonis is also that level. Of the Sham is Karbonis at the bottom of page 1218. So where does that fit into all this now? So that's now the continuation of the discussion, and that was the original question that he asked on page 1213, where he asked the question exactly that. Sorry, 12, where did he begin that? No, 1213, yeah. Where he asked the question, there he asked the question at Atzilus to Bria, sorry. The question that he asked was on page 1219. So what does the Avodah accomplish? On 1211, he's already answered it briefly in the parentheses, which we learned. Yeah, that's where he began. If you look on 1211, he says that the difference between Gan Eden and Elam Haba, so he talks about Gan Eden is the way the neshamas, before they come to this world, they're in Gan Eden, as it's on its own, and through Avodah, you have Teis V'Seir. I'm just referring to it because he's going to discuss that now. Teis V'Seir means an additional energy. That's all Gan Eden. Okay. So now he's going to discuss that. So he says, bottom of page 1220. Now, however, through the Avodah of Torah and Mitzvos, through our work and effort in Torah and Mitzvos, mamshichim teisvus eires began Eden. We draw additional, teisvus means okay, safa, additional, teisvus eires, additional abundant energies into Gan Eden. So there's Gan Eden as it is on its own, like a garden. God created a garden. And then there's the additional thing that we create and we generate in this garden through our work, through our taking care of tending to the garden. And now he says, the Medrash says this is a common expression, the Rebbe's blessings. Whenever the Rebbe would respond to when people blessed him, like on Yud Aleph Nisan, the Rebbe's birthday, or the Rebbe's anniversary, or other times, so the Rebbe would say, Hamavarach Mizbarach, the one who blesses shall be blessed, and B'barichoseh shal Kadosh Baruch Hu, with the blessing of God, which is Tesvase Meruba Le'ikir. So usually when someone gives you, for example, you have a keren, and you have the payros, which in English is you have the principal and interest. So the principal is the main bulk of money, and the interest grows on that. Now the interest could also grow exponentially even more than the principal. But by the Eibishter it says Terasvase Meruba Le'ikir, his addition is more than the original amount that was there. So when God blesses, in that sense, the Rebbe is saying, in his blessing, taken from this medrash, Tesvase Meruba Le'ikir, the additional is more than the original principle. So Gan Eden has, let's say, a measure amount of energy, so much and so much divine pleasure in it, and divine energy. But now, through Torah and Mitzvos, we add taste Eidus, and when the Eibishter, when you're drawing from, the Eidus are coming from God because he's responding to our Torah and Mitzvos, it's Meruba Le'ikir. It's even more than what was there in the first place. So if a Gan Eden, let's say, had 100, you don't just get 50, you get more than 100, basically. And obviously there's no numbers here, but the content, the context of a qualitative growth. V'hu, and now he goes back to what he said, if you remember in the beginning. And this Gan Eden now, as it's growing through Avodah and Torah and Mitzvos, is Iker Kabbalah Schar HaNeshamas B'Gan Eden. Shenenim Miziv Teirosan V'Avodasan. And this is the primary receiving of reward by the souls in Gan Eden, which means souls that were here on this earth, that they're benefiting from and enjoying the reflection of their Miziv, the reflection of the divine that comes from their Torah and their Avodah that they did. Not just like he said on page 1219, the Neshama is Kodim Boyim. They're in Gan Eden and they did not yet receive any reward because they didn't go down to this world yet and did any Avodah. There they're just basking in the glory and the divine glory and divine pleasure and delight of Gan Eden. Now we're talking that the Neshamas, that this is their Iker Schar that they receive from the Teirosan V'Avodasan, which is Meruba Ala Iker. That's through the Avodah. Okay. So now he's going to explain what that means in context of the levels we spoke about. Didn't we say Gan Eden is Bria, Bina, which includes Keser Chochmah, Gimel Rishenis, Keser Chochmah, Bina of Bria, which comes from Keser Chochmah Bina of Malchus of Atzilus, which comes from Keser Chochmah Bina of Atzilus. So what does the Avodah add to that? We already have Keser Malchus. We already have the pleasure of Keser in Gan Eden without Avodah. So the next section is going to explain what is added through Avodah, that in that context of Malchus all the way to all the way up to Keser. That's what we're going to discuss now after this. But we'll stop here because we'll stop by Indian Who, literally 3 lines from the bottom of the page. And we've now entered the world of what Avodah will accomplish. And as we shall learn, this is all Gan Eden, not even Elam Haba. Gan Eden is still Mamala Kalam. If you go back to 12:11, he says, even the Avodah that we do is ultimately all going to be Gili of Mamala Kalam. But in a higher level than the Gili of Mamala Kalam of Gan Eden on its own. So this is going to be a step-by-step process of how we slowly assimilate and integrate the divine and the divine pleasure within our beings, and slowly growing. And ultimately, we want to come, of course, to the point of Einoid, not just Havaya Elikim, but Einoid. But we're not there yet. That's going to be a while. I'm just remembering the context that all began, volume 3, with the transformation of the very concealment We're still now in the state of revelations, and now he's going to the step of what's higher than Gan Eden on its own, the Avodah, that adds Tosfos, an addition into Gan Eden, which is what we're going to continue learning in tomorrow and the next days. So, anybody want to ask anything? Because I'm going to stop here at close to the bottom of 12:20.